Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore, and I'm thrilled today to welcome Rebecca Donner for the release of All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, in conversation with Maude Newton. While the pandemic has taken a toll on all of our lives, virtual events like the one that you're about to see have become bright spots for us. And so I want to give a special thank you to our guests for joining us this evening and to all of you at home for tuning in. So now to some housekeeping. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them, and we'll be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat button through which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, very important. And one caveat for tonight's event is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise, and we'll try to resolve them quickly. We've also scheduled a whole host of summer programming for you, so do head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One event in particular that I want to point out is on Tuesday, August 24th. We're thrilled to welcome Louise Penny for her new book, The Madness of Crowds, in conversation with Dory Greenspan. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. Finally, we've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. Now a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Rebecca Donner's essays, reportage, and reviews have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Book Forum, Guernica, and The Believer. All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days is her third book. She's the author of a novel, Sunset Terrace, and Burnout, a graphic novel about eco-terrorism. She was a 2018-2019 fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography and has been awarded residencies at Yaddo, UCross Foundation, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and Vermont Studio Center. Born in Vancouver, Donner is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and Columbia University, and has taught writing at Wesleyan, Columbia, and Barnard College. Maude Newton is a writer and critic whose first book, Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation, will be published March 29th, 2022 from Random House. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, the Oxford American, and numerous other publications and anthologies, including Best American Travel Writing and the New York Times bestseller, What My Mother Gave Me. Newton was born in Dallas to a Texan mother and a Mississippian father. She grew up in Miami and graduated from the University of Florida with degrees in English and law. So now without any further ado, Rebecca and Maude, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah. I'm so honored to be here to talk with you, Rebecca, about this magnificent book. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the design as we get a little further into it. But I wanted to start out by talking about the familial connection. I know that your grandmother had asked you to write about your great-great-aunt. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I know you don't want to read for a long time, but maybe you'd like to read just the introduction briefly, and then we can talk about it a little more.
Sure. Well, I'll say just a little bit about my grandmother and how she spoke to me about this story, and then I'll dive in and read a very small excerpt. And I also want to say I'm so very pleased, Maude, that you are joining me at my book launch. For all of you who are here, I was an early reader of Maude's amazing book blog years and years ago, and I never would have imagined back then that we would be sitting here today. So it's just an absolute pleasure. Thank you. My grandmother, when I was 16, took me aside and she gave me a packet of Mildred's letters. Mildred Harnock, the subject of my book, was my grandmother's aunt. My grandmother said to me, she knew that I wanted to be a writer, that I had great ambitions to write books, and she said, you have to write this book. Here are these letters. And I took that, I took that very seriously when I made the promise to her that I would. And I knew that I would keep it, and that it was a matter not of whether I would write it, but when. And I kept those letters for a long time. I made photocopies, and she took back the originals. And so I have them here in my office. There's a huge wall of binders over here, and I've basically written all over them, these copies. And they really did help me inhabit this story and really they were a kind of portal into Mildred's mind and heart. I think what I'm going to do right now is just read just a few pages, and it makes sense to just start from the introduction so that all of you can get a sense of what this book is about and what my narrative strategy is. So here we go. Introduction. Her aim was self-erasure. The more invisible she was, the better her chances of survival. In her journal, she noted what she ate, read, thought. The first was uncontroversial. The second and third were not. For this reason, she hid the journal. When she suspected the Gestapo was closing in on her, she destroyed it, burned it, most likely. She was at the harrowing center of the German resistance, but she wasn't German, nor was she Polish or French. She was American, conspicuously so. The men she recruited acquired code names: Armless, Beamer, Worker. She operated under no code name. Still, she was elusive. The nature of her work required absolute secrecy. She didn't dare tell her family, who were scattered across the towns and dairy farms of the Midwest. They remained bewildered that she, at 26, had jumped aboard a steamer ship and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind everyone she loved. Her family is my family. 3 generations separate us. She preferred anonymity, so I will whisper her name: Mildred Harnock. In 1932, she held her first clandestine meeting in her apartment, a small band of political activists that grew into the largest underground resistance group in Berlin by the end of the decade. During the Second World War, her group collaborated with a Soviet espionage network that conspired to defeat Hitler, employing agents and operatives in Paris, Geneva, Brussels, and Berlin. In the fall of 1942, the Gestapo pounced. She was thrown in prison. So were her co-conspirators. During a hastily convened trial at the Reichskriegsgericht, the Reich Court-Martial, a prosecutor who'd earned the moniker Hitler's Bloodhound hammered them with questions. She sat on a wooden chair in the back of a courtroom. Other chairs held high-ranking Nazi officers. At the center of the room sat a panel of 5 judges. Everyone there was German except her. When it was her turn, she approached the stand. She was emaciated, her lungs ravaged by tuberculosis she'd contracted in prison. How long she stood there remains unknown. Surviving documents don't note the time the prosecutor began questioning her or the time he stopped. What is known is this: the answers she gave him were lies. Real whoppers. The judges believed her. The sentence she received was considered mild: 6 years of hard labor in a prison camp. 2 days later, Hitler overrode the verdict and ordered her execution. On February 16, 1943, she was strapped to a guillotine and beheaded. After the war, the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps opened an investigation. Mildred Harnock's actions are laudable, one CIC official observed in 1946, noting the rather extensive file they had on her. It is quite possible that investigation will disclose the commission of a war crime, wrote another. Their higher-ranking colleague later reprimanded them in a terse memo. This case is classified SR, secret restricted, and should not have been referred for investigation. Withdraw case from detachment D and do not continue the investigation. So the CIC buried her case. The reason for this would not come to light for over 50 years. Still, news leaked out. On December 1, 1947, the New York Times ran a story under the headline, "Hitler Beheaded American Woman as a Personal Reprisal" in 1943. With comprehensive knowledge of the German underground movement, Mildred Harnock stood up courageously under Gestapo torture and revealed nothing, it noted. Later that week, the Washington Post praised her as one of the leaders in the underground against the Nazis. Readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post were probably surprised to learn that an active underground resistance in Germany had even existed. A central problem for anyone who wanted to write about her group was a lack of documentary evidence. It wasn't until 1989, when the Berlin Wall came crashing down, that a trove of documents stashed in an East German archive came to light. Several years later, Russia permitted historians a peek at foreign intelligence files. And in 1998, under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, the CIA, FBI, and US Army began to release records once classified as top secret, a process that continues to this day. We now have a more nuanced understanding of the underground resistance in Germany, but factual inaccuracies persist. Details about Mildred Harnock are scant and frequently incorrect. The ashes of the journals she kept can't serve as a corrective. Despite her wish to remain invisible, she left a trail for us to follow. Along the trail are official documents, British, US, and Soviet intelligence files, Soviet-era intelligence files, thick as your wrist. Then there are the unofficial documents, which reveal deeper truths. The letters she wrote, the letters other people wrote to her and about her. Family and friends left behind notes, date books, diaries, photographs, testimonials. It can't be said that there was a consensus about the woman they knew or thought they knew. To many, she was an enigma, inspiring a range of contradictory conclusions about who she was and why she did what she did. Nearly all the people who knew her are lost to history. Those who are still alive are well into their 90s. One I hope to find more than any other. He was just a boy when he met Mildred, young enough to be her son. I tracked him down and implored him. What did she tell you? How did she enter her room? Did you hear her weep, sing? Did she trust you?
One of the things that's so magnificent about this book is that you capture her tenderness and her tenacity and her bravery, and also her willingness to pretend to be a Nazi, to use her appearance, her blonde hair, blue-eyed, Midwestern, beautiful appearance to blend in and ingratiate herself with the whole Nazi culture. And there's also this sort of echo for me of that tenderness and that tenacity in the writing itself. And I wondered if you could talk about how she ended up becoming involved as an American graduate student, how she ended up in Germany, and
Yes, well, she was born and raised in Milwaukee, and she experienced a rather impoverished childhood in a shuffle of boarding houses. Her family moved every time they couldn't pay the rent, and neither of her parents had gone to college, but in 1921, Mildred declared her desire to enroll at the University of Wisconsin, which accepted both men and women and offered free tuition to state residents. And it was there, after she received her BA in humanities and she was working on her master's degree, that she met a German exchange student, another graduate student, and he was from Germany, named Mildred Harnack. And they fell swiftly in love. The family mythology is that he wandered into the wrong lecture hall, intending to see an economist lecture, and instead saw Mildred lecturing about literature. And he approached the podium afterwards and introduced himself and apologized for his poor English, and suggested that perhaps he could take lessons from her, and then she suggested that he could teach her some German, and the rest is history. Then they married right after she got her master's degree, and in 1926. And then she decided that she would pursue a PhD in Germany. And in 1929, she joined him there, and then began lecturing at the University of Berlin about American literature. And she was appalled by the swastikas she saw everywhere and by the number of students who were members of the Nazi fraternity. And so she and Arvid both felt that it was important to oppose these fascist tendencies that they saw everywhere. And this is before Hitler became chancellor. In 1932, Mildred started holding meetings in the apartment, and as did Arvid. And she recruited her students, and she was very careful about who she would recruit in assessing who was inclined to oppose the Nazi Party. And then over the course of the decade, the group grew in fits and starts. It was a very scrappy group, a very diverse group. There were Jews in the group, there were Catholics, there were atheists, there were social democrats, there were communists, there were students, as I mentioned, but also professors and artists and attorneys and office workers and factory workers and people who were unemployed. So essentially through the rest of the decade until the Second War started, this group, as I said, grew and grew. And I feel like I'm anticipating another one of your questions, but anyway, that sort of sets the stage, and that gives you a sense of how she got to Germany, and then also how she got involved in the underground resistance.
Yeah, one thing I found so compelling about the book is the way that you show how her involvement, as you describe it here, is an outgrowth of her poverty as a child and her love of literature, and particularly literature about people who are struggling. And then the difficulties, the economic difficulties that she sees her working class students having at the second university where she teaches. And so you see this sort of emergence of this really intense political conviction, starting from a place where it could have gone in a number of directions, but it seems like really actually it couldn't. Like, it was her personality to just fully commit herself to opposing what was happening. And one thing that I've thought about a lot as I've gotten older is the way that women and people of color and queer people are often erased in stories of resistance. And, it's so interesting and telling to me here that as a strategic matter, the United States government, I'm sure, as you discussed in the book, there were a number of reasons for this, but I'm sure one of them is that she was a woman. They chose not to investigate this. They chose not to emphasize this. And yeah, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how her gender maybe made the research more complex and some of the surprising things that you discovered in that vein as you were working.
Yes, well, that's such an excellent question. And I think anyone who's done any reading on the resistance in Germany often encounters men's names, Arvid Harnack, Harro Schulze-Boysen. They were indeed also leaders of this group. And once the war broke out, and actually Arvid even before, beginning in 1935, they attempted to undermine Hitler's regime by passing intelligence about Hitler's operational strategies to the Russians, and then Mildred also and Arvid also passed that information to the United States. But you don't hear about Mildred, and you don't hear about really, it's very surprising to people to know that 40% of the group were women, and that the women were treated differently, both in terms of the way that they were acknowledged, their role in this underground resistance group. They were marginalized and even omitted from histories, and even in death they were treated differently, which I can get to later. In my research, you had asked one of the surprising things, notable things that I had found in my research. There was one U.S. intelligence document, and it was a list of the people in this group, and so there was a column for the name, column for, or I guess the date arrested, the name, the profession, and the date executed. And under the names, the men were listed, and profession, you would see, professor, attorney, factory worker, etc. And for the women, no surprises here in 2021, the profession was wife, over and over again. Wife, 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 wife. And so Mildred was a scholar, she was a professor, she had a PhD, and she was wife. And Greta Kukoff, who was in the group also, she was a professional woman. Later, she became the first woman in Germany to head a bank, a federal bank, and she was wife. So, and this kind of perception, you see this just in the historiography over and over again. Mildred Mildred and Arvid both appeared on an East German stamp, and he was Dr. Arvid Harnock, and she was Mildred Harnock, no doctor, of course. So this is a controversy that we are familiar with even today, that women are not regarded in similarly. And Mildred is often called a teacher, and Arvid is called a scholar, even though, again, both had PhDs. But getting back to the point about the resistance, there's a wonderful scholar, Claudia Kunz, who talks about how women have been marginalized, women in the German resistance for decades. And so it's really the men who we hear about. And it's the men who were the male historians and the journalists who were writing about them. And so I think this is, as the documents, after the Nazi War Crimes Act was enacted and the documents came to light, we started to learn more about the German resistance, and we have a more nuanced understanding about the German resistance. So But still there persists this idea that really the women were just accessories and the men were the ones who were really leading the resistance.
Yeah, I was reading the book in tandem with Sarah Schulman's Let the Record Show, which is sort of like sprawling document of the queer like AIDS awareness movement. And the two of them together were really fascinating to me as sort of, I mean, in a way, this book, it's such a compelling story, but it's also really inspiring for our times in the sense that you break down how Mildred built the group of students and others that was called the Circle, how it sort of grew and mutated, how there were different sort of offshoots of it. You know, in these times, it feels useful to sort of see someone spinning out resistance in this very practical way. And, you know, when you and I met several years ago after an event for a mutual friend, you were mentioning that, you know, I was getting ready to go to a residency and you had been at this residency and you were saying that it had been really a fortunate residency for you because you had remembered the name of the 11-year-old courier that your grandmother had told you that Mildred, if I may call her Mildred,
Yes.
had used. And that suddenly you discovered he was still alive and he was 89 years old. And so I wondered if you could talk about that. You do talk about it a little in the introduction, but it's just such a fascinating part of the book, the way they made that work.
Yes, yes. So yes, my grandmother told me there was this boy named Don. He was her 11-year-old courier when the Second World War began. She used him basically as a kind of go-between. I'm sorry, my cat is meowing. I'm just going to let him in. This is
I mean, hello cat lady, I am charmed. So hopefully the whole audience will say way.
Everybody can see my cat. I just adopted him two weeks ago, and this is him. Hello, everybody. All right, so hopefully he'll be quiet. So yeah, so Don, and I have a picture of him right here. This is the photo insert. There. So that's Don there, and that's Don and his. I'm doing this backwards. And his father, Donald Heath, was a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, and he was put there by Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau to basically gather information on Germany, in particular about what the Ministry of the ministries were up to, and the Ministry of Economics in particular was of interest. And this was before the United States had any kind of centralized intelligence agency. This is even before the OSS. He was put there in 1937. So in 1939, basically he started giving information to Morgenthau that he obtained from Mildred and Arvid Harnock, and in particular Arvid, because he worked at the ministry and he was stealing information. So Don Heath, Jr., the 11-year-old Don, would show up at Mildred's apartment twice a week, ostensibly for tutoring sessions in English and American literature. But these were, again, occasions for him to take back notes to his father. A lot of times the notes were basically logistical to set up meeting points and times when they could go to the Spreewald, for example, someplace outside of Berlin, hopefully away from Gestapo scrutiny. And this is when deliver information verbally that was too sensitive to write down. So Dawn, and so this went on for 2 years, from 1939 to 1941. And when I began in earnest to work on this book, I just assumed that I had waited too long. And I did not, I wasn't sure that Dawn was alive. So yes, when I went to this residency, I basically discovered when I was there that I was wrong and that he was alive. And so I talked to him, I interviewed him on the phone, and then I jumped onto a plane and flew out to California and interviewed him at length. And was just, it really changed the course of this book. His memory was so vivid, and about that particular time in his life, it was really just etched in his mind. And after he passed away, shortly thereafter, his family invited me to go through 12 steamer trunks of documents. And in those steamer trunks, I found his mother's diaries, and so, which was also just an astonishing discovery. And as well as letters and photographs and other primary source documents that helped me tell the story. So I do devote, I structured the book. I decided at that point that I wanted to follow a kind of narrative, Dawn's narrative, in parallel to Mildred's narrative. So the book, if you imagine sort of two parallel narratives, goes back and forth between the two of them. So you see Germany through the eyes of Mildred. I mean, again, this is not a novel. This is a work of narrative nonfiction. But I show you Berlin as she saw it through her letters, through documents, and through other people's letters and documents, notes and journals and testimonies. And you see Germany very swiftly moving from a parliamentary democracy to a fascist dictatorship. And it just happened in the blink of an eye. And then I follow Dawn's narrative trajectory when we get up to 1937. And then you see basically how Germany moved into the war.
That ties in perfectly with the next thing I wanted to ask you, actually, which is about the structure and the way that you wrote it. I mean, you are a novelist, and it has, one of the things that's so appealing about it is that it has this almost novelistic quality. You really sort of enter the lives, the emotions to some degree of the characters. It's just so beautifully written, line by line. And, you know, just sort of an aside for our listeners, I also found it so interesting that your great-grandmother, Mildred's sister, told the whole family to destroy all the documentary evidence. So some of the primary material was destroyed. And so only what their mother had kept was sort of available to you through your family. I wondered if you could talk about, in addition to Dawn, sort of how you made the decisions to structure things. There are some other characters whose sort of lives you go into briefly. And at the end, it's structured a little differently. And I just found that really fascinating. And before you answer, I wanted to say, Noah is gently reminding everyone, please put your questions in for Rebecca. Any questions you may have, we're going to be getting to those very soon. So, yeah.
So what was the question about structure?
About that structure, yeah. And also I'm curious whether your background as a novelist, you know, influenced your thinking about the structure.
Well, I think so, because I do approach, this is a really big epic story. And I felt, and I should also acknowledge that there was a biography that was written about Mildred Harnock by Shireen Blair Brysack called Resisting Hitler. And in fact, my grandmother gave her a lot of documents, including letters and photographs and so forth. So a conventional biography already exists in the world. It was published decades ago, but Shireen really did a phenomenal job in collecting all the information that was available at the time, and then also tracking down people and interviewing them, people who are no longer with us. But I knew that I didn't want to write a cradle to grave biography, and so I began thinking about how I could tell this story in a different way. And I had to determine, first of all, what the scope of the story was going to be. I wasn't interested in beginning with her childhood and in going into a lot of that. Again, that had already, that information is available already. So I think that I was thinking about also the other characters, and I was thinking, how am I going to, as a novelist, you can basically populate your novels with an infinite number of characters if you want. It depends on how imaginative you want to be, I was limited in the sense that I could only put in people who actually existed, because this is a work of nonfiction. But there were quite a lot of people. And I really also wanted to bring in her friends and her co-conspirators and her enemies, her family members. I wanted to bring in as many points of view as possible to look at the central figure of Mildred. And I also wanted to tell the story of other people. Among them are these people I'm speaking of, whose stories have gone untold. And those include women in her group. And I followed them through their acts of resistance along with Mildred, their arrest by the Gestapo, their incarceration at Gestapo headquarters, and they were then sent to women's prisons, to the court hearing and the mass trial at the Reich Court Martial, and their execution, and then they were actually, the women were sent off, their bodies were sent off to the head of anatomy at the University of Berlin, Hermann Stieve, who had dissected them to investigate the effects of acute stress on the reproductive system of women. So this is what I was alluding to earlier. The women were treated differently than the men. The men were hanged, the women were beheaded, by and large. There were some exceptions. But so I had this sense of the various kind of narrative threads I wanted to follow. I also wanted to track down Mildred's cellmate at the prison where she was in solitary confinement for a long time, but then they did give her a cellmate for a month. And I knew her story hadn't really been told. So I did a lot of research in Berlin to try to find out who she was. And a lot of what I know about how Mildred's days were, what she ate, what she did in that cell, a lot of that information comes from this woman, Gertrude, who wrote 2 letters to Mildred's mother-in-law after the war and described in great poetic detail her time with Mildred. I fear I'm getting a little bit off track. So, but in terms of my experience as a novelist, yes, I think that I'm familiar managing lots of characters, and also thinking about the scope of something and how to focus a narrative too. I didn't want it to be so sprawling that the reader would just lose track of the central narrative. So yeah, those were all of my thoughts while I was structuring this book.
I think you perfectly answered my compound sprawling. So yeah, apologies for the disorganization of that. What, you know, I'm looking for questions. I feel like people must have questions. It's really yeah, but I just wanted to kind of show everyone, you showed some of the photos earlier, but here we have like a few snippets of letters and other documents. And then I know that you held firm and the cover does not have a swastika, but instead it has some parts of your research. So maybe you'd like to talk about, you know, which parts of your research felt necessary to include in that way?
Yes, I conducted a tremendous amount of research in archives in Berlin and London, in DC, and also across the country, and in Wisconsin. And also I worked with a researcher in Moscow who accessed intelligence files and other documents for me. So I just, it was a process of winnowing it down, and you know, the old saw about the iceberg, and you see, you know, you just see the tip of the iceberg, but 90% of it is submerged beneath the water. That accurately describes my book. There's so much you don't see, but it definitely does inform the book. Those snippets that you pointed out, and I think our readers out there are, I would love for people to know that I have a kind of, I decided to use a scrapbook kind of strategy, because I felt that it's important for people to understand that, to see some of these documents. And so I sort of pepper them throughout. And now, so you'll see just slivers of picture like that. We have, of course, as soon as I'm looking for the documents, I can't find any, but they're here. And so you'll see basically, or throughout, there are fragments from her prison questionnaire that I discovered. And then you'll see, I don't know if you can see, but bits of letters, little snippets of letters that she wrote. And this is all my sense in diary entries. That's what you showed earlier was a snippet of a diary entry. Also declassified documents like this. And so I wanted the reader to follow along with me in a kind of scholarly detective story, sort of coming alongside, discovering the story kind of in the way that I discovered the story, the way that I uncovered documents. So I use them as a way to sort of bring more texture into the story.
I see we have a question here, and the question is from Catherine. How has the process of researching and writing the book been for your family, for the relatives? Has that been emotional?
I think, you know, it was, I actually didn't talk about my book very much to my family when I was writing it. I wanted very much for it to be in my head while I was writing it. I didn't want to be influenced by anybody else. And it wasn't just my family, it was also just people. I mean, as writers, you know, there sometimes something occurs when you talk too much about your book, you sort of lose the magic. So I would tell my family, I'm writing a book about Mildred, but I didn't go into great detail. I mean, I think that, yes, everybody on that side of the family knows about this figure in our family, and it's a very, it's a story that is sort of lingers, you know, it's always present as a kind of spectral presence. And also, I think, so, and there's this desire, I think, for, in my family, for, you know, to share the story with the world. And so, as you mentioned earlier, my great-grandmother did urge family members, this is right after the war and right as we sort of moved into the Cold War, she urged family members to burn whatever they had on Mildred, letters, photographs. And she said, the sooner that we dispose of these things, the faster we can get on with our lives. I discovered this quotation in a letter. And there was also, she said that also because she was concerned about the taint of communism, because at that point, all that was being written about in the newspapers was about how Mildred Harnock was involved in a sensationalistic conspiracy, communist conspiracy. So she was being viewed through a Cold War lens. And so, but there are family members who have, you know, I would call people up and say, do you have anything? Do you have anything at all that has been preserved, you know? And so everybody gets very excited about participating in that way.
You know, one thing that I found really interesting was that you made a decision not to center your grandmother, even though I assume that was your grandmother, the Jane in the book.
Yeah, that's my grandmother.
Germany, and was living there. And at the end, oh yeah, of course it was your grandmother. And then at the end of the war was, had escaped to, you know, had escaped Germany. And your great grandmother found out she was safe from the Baltimore Sun. You know, so I found it interesting that you weren't really centered in the book. She wasn't centered in the book as a connection to you, and her husband, Otto, who was also a figure in the book, wasn't. You know, you dealt with that in a really interesting way, very like really served the narrative, but I think that a lot of writers might not have been able to resist the temptation to sort of tie it back in a more explicit way.
You know, I also, thank you very much for that. And I also want to point out that I did make the decision not to insert myself into this narrative. And I think early on when I did start talking just a little bit about this, and then stop talking about it while I worked on it, people would say, well, why don't you put yourself in the narrative? That, you know, why don't you tell your own story alongside Mildred's? And I felt very strongly that I didn't belong in the Weimar era, or the, you know, in Germany, or throughout the 30s on through the Second World War. Contemporary Rebecca has no place there. And it's not interest, much more interest. My thoughts about my story, sort of the story behind the story, is not nearly as interesting as Mildred's story. So that was a choice that I made early on.
Yeah, it really does serve the book. I see that we have from Danielle a compliment for the book. She's really interested. Her mother was in the resistance in France and was deported to Auschwitz. And she is going to recommend your book to her book club, and maybe Noah can pass along, facilitate an invitation there that she seems to be extending.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
And yeah, anyone else, any questions for Rebecca? Oh, I see. I'm looking at the chat rather than the Q&A. I thought I knew everything about Zoom, and it turns out I was so wrong. Let's see what we have here. So Robert, is asking if there's anything about the degree to which McCarthyism and the Cold War impeded earlier awareness.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I discussed that in toward the end of the book, really the story about why her case was buried. And again, it had everything to do with the Cold War. And in fact, one CIC official wrote in a top secret memo that was subsequently declassified, he said, basically it's important for us to recognize that Mildred Harnock's execution was justified in our estimation. This is an American official saying that an American woman fighting the Nazi regime who was beheaded on Hitler's direct order, that punishment was justified. So that tells you something about McCarthyism and the way in which the taint of communism that sort of surrounded her influenced how the United States government treated her. And her case was buried, as I said, for 50 years.
Just appalling. So Simona was asking about documents that might not be available even now because they're still classified.
Yes, I had to submit a number of FOIA requests, for Freedom of Information Act requests, for documents in intelligence files that were just covered with redaction and big black splotches, which just shocked me in 2018, which was when I started, that was around the time when I started getting those documents. So, there are still some documents that I had to send an appeal because my first request was denied, and in 2018, somehow it was still important to keep this file on Mildred Harnock secret, and then I did succeed in getting some of those files declassified, but some are still classified.
Someone else is wondering, Karen is wondering if your book is also in any way a commentary on historiography.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that was a very explicit artistic choice.
And someone else, this ties in with the earlier question, as much as gender filtering has diminished Mildred's role and accomplishments, do you think that this erasure also could have been coming from the deeply embedded US Cold War attitudes toward quote unquote communist cooperation, even though the US was also cooperating with Russia during World War II?
What was the first part of the question? Just whether...
As much as gender has diminished, sort of the filtering around gender has diminished awareness of her role, whether the Cold War,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely. It's so interesting to me that when the profile ran in the New York Times, there was a profile of me that was published online on Sunday and will be published in print next Friday, I believe it is. There are a lot of, I was surprised by the number of comments on the profile that were basically condemning her for being associated with communists, still to this day. How can she be somebody who we are celebrating when she was a communist? Those are the kinds of quotations that, the comments that people have written in 2021. So it's and there are a lot of again, that's the name of the group that was finally given to them by German intelligence, the Abwehr, was the Red Orchestra, the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra, and that also is one of the reasons that there is this impression that they were all a bunch of Soviet, communist spies, basically, and that is erroneous. And I go into that and sort of unpack that to a great extent in my book.
Someone else was wondering if you were able to talk with any of the descendants of members of the Red Orchestra more broadly, and if their experiences were similar to Mildred's experience, and if the families had a sort of similar experience to yours.
Yes, I mean, especially, I did conduct interviews with whoever I could find. Yes, well, this was a problem. And after the war, some of the survivors, Greta Kukov, Gunther Weissenborn, Falk Harnock, who was Arvid's brother, all experienced a kind of a backlash in Germany for their involvement in the resistance. And it depends on who was doing the observing, whether they were West Germans or East Germans. But it was a very problematic reception after the war. And for quite some time, again, I mean, that kind of treatment of the group and the mythologies that surround it and the misinterpretations and the misapprehensions really have persisted for decades.
Someone else, and you talk about this so beautifully in the book, it's a great question to end on. Can you talk about how Dana was wondering if Don Heath's memories were clear or a little foggy? And I know you can really speak.
Yeah, you know, about Berlin, they were very clear. It was wonderful to sit down with him and to hear him tell the stories about those tutoring sessions and how his father would instruct him, and Mildred too, to take a different path to her apartment every time he went. I asked him numerous times during the interview, what U-Bahn stop did you get off at? Which block did you walk down? And then later I went to Berlin and I traced all of those routes just to make sure whether they actually worked out, and they all did. So that was part of my detective work. So I think, you know, I do think that for some people, when they have a very powerful emotions around a particular event in their past, even though it was many, many, many years ago, even when he was 11, the memory holds on to it. So, and again, I was able to corroborate so much when I discovered that his mother's diaries were in those steamer trunks. And he also wrote some autobiographical essays and so forth. So I had a number of different entry points, again, into those chapters about him.
We have one more question, maybe very quickly. I see Noah's here, so we need to wind it up and thank everyone and remind you to buy the book. But one final thing, was there any major surprise in your research, in your family, you know, that sort of rebut family lore or otherwise?
I think there were a number of them, and I know that, so I'm just going to isolate one. I think, well, actually, the discovery that my great-grandmother ordered everybody to burn everything, that was a surprise. I didn't realize it. And I came across that, again, in a letter. So that was one. And the other one, so big discovery was that when I was in Berlin at the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, the German Resistance Memorial Center, I had the great fortune of working with Dr. Hans Koppe, whose parents were in the group, Mildred's resistance group, Mildred and Arvid's group, and they were executed. In fact, his mother gave birth in prison, and then she was executed, Hilde Koppe. Hans Koppe Jr. went on and basically devoted his life to researching the resistance. And so he's a co-director of the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, and he gave me access to a lot of documents. And one of these documents were the notes that were passed in prison among women in Mildred's group. So anyway, I have a scan of one of them in the, I cannot believe it, I just opened up the page to the exact page right there. This is, if you see that right there. So you basically, these were notes that women would fold up and sew into the hems of their garments or stuff into the crevices of the prison walls. And this is how they communicated with one another. I see that it's 8:30. I do want to, and we have to close, and I have 2% of battery left on my computer. So if I just crash, that's why. I don't know where my power cable is. I want to also thank all the people who helped me make this book what it is, and that includes, I worked with a number of research assistants and translators, and Jude Vachon, who might be watching tonight, I hope she is. She did an extraordinary work in helping me go through all of the, just thousands and thousands of pages of almost illegible German documents. And of course, I have many other people to thank, including my wonderful editor and Asi Mushnik and Jim Rutman, my wonderful agent, Lee Boudreau, who acquired this book on proposal. She was the first editor, and everybody at Little Brown who have helped bring this book into the world.
Thank you.
Again, buy the book from Community Bookstore. Obviously, it's the right thing to do, and it's a beautiful book.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Maud. This was a really fascinating conversation. I was totally enraptured the whole time. So thank you so much for sharing this story. Again, I hope everyone at home. Oh, we've lost Rebecca. I hope everyone at home will get a copy of the book, and we hope to see you at another virtual event at Community Bookstore very soon. Thanks again. Have a great evening.
Good night.